Hey, my name is John Santaferraro, and this is the Digital Analyst, where AI makes sense and digital dominance begins.
The Digital Analyst with John Santaferraro, powered by Insight Jam.
One of the brand promises of the Digital Analyst is to make AI make sense. In a world where every form of media is inundated with messages regarding AI every single day, there is no shortage of noise. Amid the noise, there are several common misconceptions worth mentioning, and that's what we want to talk about today. At the very top of the list is a misconception that has followed us for decades. Where marketers have overused analytics, they came up with the idea of advanced analytics. When advanced analytics got tired and everything under the sun had become advanced analytics, they came up with the idea of machine learning, which was a fancy name for advanced analytics. When machine learning got old and had run its course, they simply renamed it AI, artificial intelligence. And guess what? Everyone believed it. Right now, we're watching the next AI wave swell around AI agents. And of course, we're already seeing the fog surround it. Every time people see a wave, they want to ride it, whether it's their wave or not. And the latest misconception is that generative AI equals agentic AI, that Gen AI applications are actually AI agents. It couldn't be further from the truth. A Gen AI app is a part of agency, but it doesn't meet the full requirement. Fortunately, our guest today is my good friend Scott Davis, a brilliant technologist, successful entrepreneur, author, and philosopher turned philanthropist. With all that he has accomplished in the data and analytics space, he happens to have a very simple way of making complex misconceptions easy to understand. And that's why he's here today. After years in management and management consulting, Scott founded two companies, a business intelligence software company and a highly specialized analytics services and managed services company, which is still in operation today. After taking a break to sail the South Pacific and Caribbean, he founded a sailboat manufacturing company. He's the author of the inspiring book, Surf the Seesaw, and a year and a half ago, he founded Fulcrum Communities. Get this, a Colorado nonprofit corporation that develops rent-controlled homes for medium-income households. Now you can see why I call him a technologist, entrepreneur, philosopher turned philanthropist. So grab a glass of wine or a cup of coffee and join me on my Tuscan farm in the hills between Lucca and Florence for the Digital Analyst. A big digital welcome to my good friend Scott Davis. Scott, welcome to the Digital Analyst.
John, it is always fun to be with you.
I am so excited for this episode. But before we begin, I just got to go back to a memory. I'm pretty sure it was 15 years ago that you and I met on a raft on the Rogue River. And by the way, big thanks to Scott Humphrey for that introduction and for putting us into that tiny, what do they call those little, it was a
Tahiti's. It's an inflatable, I guess, canoe, but about, 8 feet, 9 feet long. So for, 200-pound-ish guys, it was a very intimate get to know you, let's say.
I have to say, though, that Scott's Northwest BI Summit was one of the best think tanks that I've experienced, at least. It was, and the relationships that we developed there are still going strong today.
Yeah, this is a really special thing that he's got going there, and to bring in that sort of high octane talent and find a way to make it real, make it sort of an unconference. It's just really special. I have no idea how to do it. I just know that it was wonderful, and some of my favorite of my people, the great thinking people, people that stretch you and that's really where those relationships came from. So it was literally priceless. I would say if there's any way that you can get a ticket, you need to get a ticket and go.
That is so true. Well, hey, we're here today to talk about some of the misconceptions around AI. One of my pet peeves is that too many people talk about AI in a way that fits their agenda. Marketers, right, who want to sell something, thought leaders who want to stand out. And most people end up using terminology and descriptors however the rest of the crowd seems to be, and the movement goes on. And they just want to catch the AI wave. One of the examples, if you take artificial intelligence, the way it has been defined for decades, as a machine with intelligence like that of a human, the ability to reason and to learn, to act autonomously, to adapt in human-like ways, then 99% of what we're calling AI today isn't even AI. It's
No.
just everyone wants AI so badly that no one noticed when AI became a buzzword that it was just machine learning, or that when generative AI hit, it was a small AI. It wasn't a big I.
Right. Well, I think it's a really fascinating, super meta point to say, hey, we have these tools which are in effect semantic correlation engines, and we've used a semantic label for them, which is so malleable that it actually means something quite different. So it's fascinating that we would, show the weakness of the approach in the naming of the thing. Just super fascinating, right? Because this would never have been construed as AI 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Like, this would not meet the definition. But we've just changed the way we use the word, which is really an interesting question for a technology that's fundamentally based upon and is intermediated by semantics. So the real world exists on one level, semantics exist at a different level above that. And if we point technology at semantics, then you have to recognize that there's an extra degree of freedom in there.
From your perspective, what are some of the misconceptions that you see being propagated in the market today? And how can we clarify the issues?
Yeah, I'm really much more interested in questions because I think that everybody's going to have a unique context. Everybody's going to have a unique purpose in how they want to apply these technologies. Even product designers are going to have should have a unique use case toward which they're designing. And so what's useful to me is to back up to kind of first principles and ask questions that apply to everyone, and everyone's going to have unique answers to them. But questions like, for instance, what category of technology is this? So are we talking about a kind of binary step function technology, something that allows us to do things that we categorically could not do before? Or are we talking about an incremental technology? And some, classic pairings would be, for instance, an electron microscope versus binoculars. So binoculars allow me to see a bit further. Electron microscope allows me to see categories of things that are simply not possible. I have not even a glimmer of those things in my eyes. Or think about penicillin as a technology or development versus genetically modified wheat. So genetically modified wheat fits into an ecosystem without requiring any change to that industrial ecosystem. It's still wheat, it's still ground, it's still used for flour and all the other things. It's still consumed the same way. It's just grown a different way and requires different inputs. Penicillin requires a different delivery mechanism. It requires refrigeration. It requires new policies and standards and blah, blah, blah. Just a whole ecosystem of modification. So when we talk about whatever tech, it could be LLMs, it could be self-driving cars, it could be drones, it could be whatever. The very first question is, how do you see this tech? Do you see this as a binary step function tech, or do you see it as an incremental tech? Because your answer in how you classify that is going to inform your strategy for how you're going to try to integrate that with the ecosystem, or what your responsibility is for modifying the ecosystem itself.
And given that, then where we're at in AI, it seems like we haven't achieved that step function that you're talking, or the change of paradigm, right? Where you have to do everything differently, because this is fitting right into everything else just the way it operates right now.
It feels incremental, but incremental that is a lot incremental. Let's just say, like, the speed improvement is substantial. The scope improvement is substantial. And so, the one objection I would say to this kind of categorization would take us back to, Marshall McLuhan, The Medium is the Message, and a related point, which is that quantity can change the quality of a thing. And so if it's incrementally faster, but it's substantially incrementally faster, such that, for instance, it can solve problems which we would not on our own with other tools be able to solve in our lifetime, well, you might see that as a binary step function. So I think that those are questions that I would leave to folks to decide for themselves, just to make sure that their answers to those questions then inform a coherent strategy based on that. So if you think that it's incremental, then your strategy should be, how do we plug this in with the minimum change to the existing ecosystem? And if you think it's binary, then you have to say, how do we seek out complementary innovators around us in the enabling ecosystem, such that we can deliver that tech? And I see people in the AI space taking both of these approaches. I just don't particularly see people asking the question and answering it and kind of holding themselves to a standard of coherence with that answer.
Well, part of that is because the people who are making incremental steps want you to believe that they have made that binary step into a new category, into a new technology, because they want to be perceived as the latest and greatest, and we've finally done it, just from a market perception standpoint. And that really muddies the water. It makes it really difficult for people to actually understand what's happening. I'm seeing this happen right now with agentic AI, where people have very simple semantic models with an LLM. It's generative AI, and they're calling them agents, but there's no agent. The agency doesn't even exist.
Yeah, I think that when you get to the word agent, some really powerful questions that people should ask and answer explicitly and transparently for everyone is, for instance, what do you mean by agent? Like, in the use of the word in common parlance, is a representative of mine that can speak for me, that can bind me contractually, that I am willing to be liable for their actions within a clearly defined scope. And so when we say agentic AI, do we literally mean AI that meets those definitions? Or are we, again, taking a word that has a common parlance and saying, hey, by the way, we're going to use this word. We're either not going to define it, the new definition of it, or we're just going to bastardize it, or we're going to adhere to it. I don't know that everyone is agreeing that when they say agentic, they're embracing the idea that, hey, we're going to have decision rights here. We're going to clearly articulate the boundary of delegation and the boundary of autonomy that this thing has. And the classic examples there would be, I have an assistant who does my travel planning. And that assistant understands my preferences. It understands which airlines I like and where I like to sit, and how a flight over 6 hours is very different for me than a flight under 6 hours, and how I want to deal with that. And it understands my preferences in terms of how much I'm willing to pay extra to be on this airline versus that airline, or to not have to fly after this hour. But exceeding those particular boundaries, this person comes back to me and says, hey, I couldn't actually find a solution within that space. And here's kind of the challenge that I'm having with that. And how would you like for me to proceed? That's a great example of an agentic relationship that we have in the real world. And if we intend, by using the word agentic, on AI to say that we're building an analogy to that in the technology world, then I'd ask the same question. How do we not just train the thing to do a thing, but how do we define the scope within which it's allowed to do that thing without interacting with me again? And how do we establish exception processes? And is there a feedback loop? Those sorts of questions, I think, are really important because, again, we're talking about these agents are probabilistic. They are not deterministic. But John, you are not probabilistic. I trust you as my friend. And what that really means is that I have a relatively reliable model of how you're going to behave within particular circumstances and subject to particular stimuli. And if you were to start using a probabilistic agent to interact with me on your behalf, I think it's pretty likely that that behavior would not correspond to your behavior. It would not conform to my model of you. And so then I'm left with the question, well, does this thing actually speak for you? Does it actually act for you? Have you empowered it to do so? And if you have, how is that affecting your identity? And how is that going to affect my trust relationship with you, not just your trust relationship with your agent? So these are questions that I think are really important to ask because they open up new vistas of product design instead of a very narrow notion of product design that's sort of very tasky and buttony. It broadens it to how is a human being going to envision a new existence for themselves in which this product allows them to project themselves out into the world in new ways. And what's the hair that comes with that? How do we manage that hair?
Want more Insight Jam? Follow us on Instagram for exclusive content like a daily dose of best practices and buying advice from industry experts and leading solution providers. Or subscribe to our YouTube channel for long-form highlights from our expert panel discussions. The Solutions Review team is hard at work collecting the best enterprise technology information from around the globe, so don't miss out.
You started with a really simple question that I think is a powerful question, and yet so basic, right? Just ask, what do you mean by agent? And
100%.
From my perspective, please stop calling a software program that can book a flight for me an agent. That's not an agent. That's a task oriented. The software is completing a task. It's not an agent. It doesn't represent me. It doesn't know me. It may know a few facts about me. And it seems to me like most of what are being called agents today can complete tasks, and that's about it. And I don't think we should call them agents.
I think it's probably a gradient scale, like a lot of things, and different people are going to answer that question differently. Some will agree with you, some probably not. But for instance, to go back to the sort of flight booking arrangement, if that's part of a suite of capabilities that revolve around managing my away from home schedule, it involves having access to my credit cards. It involves making sure that I'm getting my points and things like that. And then I'm using them in ways that I like. If it is a situation in which that capability to book flights is housed within a relatively autonomous zone of delegation such that I don't actually have to think about it a whole lot and I only deal with exceptions, then I would say that that's scooting closer to the notion of agency. But I don't know exactly which of these products you're talking about, and it's entirely possible that they have kind of dumbed the thing down so that it kind of looks like an Excel macro, in which case I would say, well, that's probably not agentic.
Hey, you and I had a conversation the other day, and it really intrigued me. You were basically saying that you can tell that there are blind spots in people's perceptions about AI by the questions that they are not asking.
True. I think it's fair. I think that the negative space around a conversation is as important as, what people actually shine a light on. And so, go back to the question of you think about agentic, it's someone who represents me or something that represents me, and it is my delegate to do things. It is authorized by me to act within a specific sphere. It has certain decision rights, and we've agreed to certain exception handling protocols. I trust it. It speaks for me, and it affects my identity, and it affects my trust relationship with other people. If that is the case, then what we've started to see now is that there's actually multiple interfaces, and we could think about those interfaces as being out to other API enabled systems that the agent might interact with. Those could be BI tools, for instance. It could be databases. It could be analytic engines. It could be airline reservation systems. It could be a whole host of platforms, and that all fits into one category, which is it's not me.
Right.
But the other main interface is me. And so as we think about that, then there's kind of two layers of learning that are happening inside these things, or two layers of mastery and configuration and tuning. One is with respect to the systems that the thing is interfacing to affect the things that I want it to do, the outcomes that I want it to affect for me. And the other is it's interfacing to me to understand preferences. It's interfacing to me to understand how to deal with error handling. What are my bounds of trust on it, and how do we deal with that? And so as you think about that, it raises really, really interesting questions about are we designing for a one-layer model, a one-layer world in which the agent exists only between me and, let's just say, enterprise platforms, in which case you would say, well, then that's going to be owned by the enterprise. But then on the other side, you could say, but yeah, a lot of this stuff is deeply personalized. So you and I interact with the same query tool. We interact with the same analytic engine, and I have very different preferences for how I want to be informed about exceptions and outliers than you do. And that's relative to me. And so then you could think, and in travel, we will clearly have very different answers. And so are we designing for a one-layer world in which one size fits all, or are we designing for a two-layer world with 2 degrees of freedom in which we have kind of an agentic interface to a shared set of platforms, and then we have a separate agentic interface which is related to learning about me, the individual that's interfacing with those things? And in that world, you start to ask the question, does this resemble the bring your own device dilemma that we ran into with the advent of smartphones? And what did we learn about that? And how can we take those models and analogize to what is it going to look like as AI comes in? And are we going to allow B2C AI agents that are owned by our employees to come in and be used in our environment? And if not, we better have a real good answer for why.
It's so interesting because I haven't heard any conversations about this topic, and I haven't really heard any AI vendors talking about the fact that they are really fine-tuning it to a person. When I am hired by a company, I'm hired because of my experience and because of the way I make decisions in that position in that company, and I'm compensated for that as well. But we are complex beings. The idea that a machine can have the kind of presence of mind that I might have in order to navigate relationships, to navigate decisions about business, to decisions about finance, decisions about customers, that I haven't seen indications that we're moving in that direction. We haven't figured out how to get into the mind of somebody who does a job well to be able to create an application that does a job with that kind of humanity. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think you see the beginnings of that conversation happening at the edge, which is kind of where you would usually see it. So Donald Farmer has written recently about, are we talking about automation or are we talking about augmentation? Like, again, some of these sort of axiomatic questions that should be asked and answered very clearly before doing anything. What is the intent? Because if your intent is to augment, then you have a human-centric ecosystem with all of the incredible advantages that come with that. Like, we are incredible ambiguity resolution machines. Human beings are. Well, if you take us out of that, then you have to account for the fact that you are now going to banish ambiguity. And that, friend, is a big ask. But then that's like the automation question. But then the augmentation question says, oh, well, we get to keep human beings. We get all of their ambiguity resolution strengths, but it comes with kind of some of the social hair that, sometimes engineers don't want to deal with. And so asking and answering that question up front is so important. And of course it is. That's why Donald, makes such a point of it. But I think that in the runaway to relabel everything under the sun as AI and kind of not miss out on this gravy train of shareholder value, explosion for all things AI. I think some shortcuts probably are being taken. Generally, those shortcuts are going to be taken in the areas that we are least comfortable with. And I would say as engineers, mostly what we're least comfortable with is starting with philosophical first principles. And so that's what I urge you to go back to.
That's a good direction to take it. Thinking about philosophy, I teach a course on IDEO's 10 Faces of Innovation to inform people how to think about analytics, how to think about AI. And I think it applies here. One of the 10 faces of innovation is cross-pollination. Looking at other disciplines, from human nature to anatomy, from physics to chemistry, and we can't forget philosophy, right? And by looking at these other disciplines, we can find ways to think more accurately about AI. And so I think that this is an opportunity to bring in the concepts of philosophy to be able to govern how we think about AI and even maybe how we guide it towards the future.
Yeah, and I think those philosophical questions pertain to just about anything that relates to human beings. I think there's another area of cross-pollination which is, fascinating to me. So I'll just say that one of the challenges I think with the semantic model, which is the LLM model, is the sort of fundamental ambiguity that the semantic layer interjects between the understanding agent, let's just say the AI model itself, and underlying reality. It's intermediated through semantics. And I think that's a real problem. That is taking you back to Plato's cave, right? This is an incredible disadvantage that the AI tools have relative to a human being. If we only could ever understand a tree by looking at the shadow of a tree, how impoverished would our understanding of a tree be? But to be able to climb a tree, walk around a tree and touch a tree and see a tree fall and chop a tree up and smell the leaves of the tree and all of these things that we can do with the tree in the real, literal world. I mean, it's just a tremendous advantage that we have that most of these models, don't have. And that leads me to think that some of the areas that we can, that are most exciting for the emergence of, AGI, true AI. I think that they're going to have what I'll call a wireframe understanding of the universe that's not going to be intermediated through semantics. And so I look at some kind of weird and interesting places that we might see this emergence happen. Video games. There is a platform called Unreal Engine in which many, many video games are developed, and it has a comprehensive physics model of any world that you create. And that's just a fascinating, you could think about it as a simulacrum of a laboratory of the universe, right? And so if you were able to hook up a curious AI that could run experiments in this space, it could literally understand how does a ball of a certain size and a certain, let's say, inflation and elasticity, how does that react when dropped from a certain height onto a particular substance, and change the substances and begin to learn. So that's, to me, really, really fascinating area where we could see some borrowing happen. And then the other is scientific simulation software. There's some great, interesting stuff out there. Everybody's aware of AlphaFold, the protein folding simulation tool, which understands some basic principles of life and has been able to extend that and apply that in ways that, we would never have been able to do it as human beings. And then there's another startup called Future House that's doing scientific laboratory automation and artificial intelligence being injected into that. So you could think about creating a world in which the rules of particular chemistries are manifest in that world, and then the AI agent is allowed to experiment and learn and adapt subject to the parameters of that world. That to me those are what I would call wireframe models. And they are, incredibly powerful for avoiding this sort of semantic intermediation, for getting AI out of the cave and out to interact with real trees.
What you describe is exactly why I love the example of what we call the self-driving car or autonomous vehicles.
Right.
And companies like Tesla and Waymo have already created cars that will, we say, drive themselves. But in reality, what they've done is they have created an AI agent that mimics everything that a human driver does when they're at the helm. And it's an agent. And that agent, like you said, it has been set free. But in order to do that, that AI agent has to mimic just a myriad of actions taken by the driver of a car. The agent has to be able to perceive the world around the car constantly, react to what appears, react to what's happening in the car. The cars, therefore, had to be fitted with all of these digital sensors for all conditions. The agent needs to be able to steer and accelerate and brake with smooth precision. So it needs perception of the context and the ability to react based on, in thousands or millions of possible situations or outcomes. And that's something that the human mind does automatically.
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful example for us to learn from for product design, for other AI tools, in the sense that it allows us to see an object lesson in the question of what does it mean to be an agent. So, for instance, if you're in your full self-driving electric vehicle, it's driving you around, it runs into a school bus. Are you allowed to say, "Hey, it wasn't me. It was the car"? Like, no, you're really not. And so, what I see many of my friends with full self-driving doing is trusting it on the freeway, and as soon as they exit, disengaging it. And that's not something that they're required to do. It's just something where these particular folks have said, this is my boundary of trust. Right? Beyond this, I'm not willing to tolerate the risk return of having you act on my behalf. I'm willing to do it out here, but not over there. And everybody's going to have a different choice, a different sort of comfort level for that risk and return, and sort of creating an affordance to say here but no further is something that I think we can all pattern match as we're doing AI product development. Decision rights and delegation and trust they need to be dealt with explicitly. They can't just be assumed away.
And I think in order to arrive there, you can't train models with semantics only. That doesn't do it. I mean, in order to achieve what they have even achieved today, these self-driving car companies, they had to create all of these possible worlds that reflect every possibility that could happen, every road condition, every possibility happening on every road condition, every possible fault in the car that could happen that would affect the control of the car. They generated massive amounts of data, synthetic data, to be able to mimic all of the possibilities of what could happen. That's what cost them the billions and billions of dollars. That's, for example, why Cruise suddenly shut the doors, right? And they stopped. GM said, we can't afford to keep doing that. So it's not an easy path forward.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I do like about the sort of tasky, tightly defined domains of working on this, is that it seems to avoid a lot of the assuming away that happens when we try to build a global or a universal or a generic tool, a one-size-fits-all tool, as opposed to, this is my tool, for doing this particular thing. And in this particular space, I'm trying to automate something that I do or that someone does for me. And so I have a reference prototype, i.e., for instance, Brandy has been making travel arrangements for me for 20 years. And so I hold up my new, travel agent against Brandy and say, you must be able to do the things that Brandy does. And so I have this kind of reference. She's the reference. Can you do what she does? And if the answer is yes, good. And if the answer is no, I'm not going there. Decision rights and all of that stuff kind of come in very clearly when we start to do that. So I'm a big fan of that simply because it allows us to build kind of baby steps, models of how this stuff is going to interact with us. And it allows us to see these questions that I keep raising, which sometimes when we're talking about, these big grand things of, it's going to replace search. Well, that just seems so grand and so generic that we really just don't come to grips with some of the fundamental questions.
Solutions Review is inviting you to join InsightJam.com. What started a few years ago as a social media event to celebrate enterprise technology has now grown into an always-on tech community with live events, discussions, videos, vendor showcases, and industry resources. Our vetted roster of experts, thought leaders, and analysts are sharing tips and tricks daily. So if you're interested in getting involved, join the long list of companies and brands who have already participated by visiting InsightJam.com today.
And it brings up another question too, because we've seen the generative AI, we've seen the task-based AI agents. We have examples where there are, maybe we call them super agents. I don't have a name for it, where like a self-driving car, but it costs billions of dollars to be able to do something like that. What about artificial intelligence, the real thing? I know the market calls it AGI, right? Artificial general intelligence, the ability to truly reason and think and learn in human-like ways. How do you see that? How do you see it coming? When? What's the path there? What are your thoughts?
I think the biggest question that everybody should be asking is whether you believe that LLMs, machine learning, the way that we do things today in the probabilistic world, do you believe that this is the direct genetic technical forebear of AGI? If you do, if you believe that this is in the technical germline that will lead us to AGI, then because AGI has essentially infinite value, you can justify spending $1 trillion on LLM because it's a gold rush to find the Willy Wonka ticket that's going to buy you infinite value at the end. So do you believe that? If you believe that, then you can do a lot. If you don't, however, believe that, if you believe that LLMs are really, really useful and machine learning is really, really useful, but that it is not a direct genetic forebear of AGI, then you need to be very careful about how you allocate investment today, because AGI will happen. And the day after AGI happens, the value of LLM will be very, very much different than infinity. It will be very, very low. So this is just a fundamental question you have to ask. And as an executive, there are questions you can ask about how do we best apply LLM technology within our enterprise. Those are really appropriate. But when it comes to the question of how much should I invest in doing so, I think you have to take a step back and dig a little bit deeper and have a crisp understanding of the technology that's underneath and whether you are willing to bet that LLM will eventually evolve to something from which true AGI will emerge. My 2 cents worth on that is I'm very skeptical. I don't see an affordance for self-scaffolding, experimentation, for getting rid of this semantic intermediation between the thing and the outside world. So I'm very skeptical about that. I think it's incredibly valuable, but I seriously doubt that we're going to see true AGI emerge from a semantic probabilistic model.
Scott, you are one of the most brilliant minds that I know. That's why I have described you to our audience as brilliant technologist, successful entrepreneur, author, and philosopher turned philanthropist. And I didn't tell you I was going to ask you about this, but
Yeah.
I cannot let you get away with talking about Fulcrum Communities, because it's beautiful to see how you have had a successful life as a technologist. And a year and a half ago, you decided to make a difference in this world and to give back. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing at Fulcrum Communities and what your vision
Sure.
is there?
Yeah. Well, housing in a lot of metropolitan areas around the world is, it's really terrifically expensive compared to wages, and particularly for the middle class, middle income professionals, it's just very, very difficult. And that has profound implications for entrepreneurs being able to find and retain talent. It has profound implications politically for having a thriving, stable middle class. And, the government has its hands full with, lower income housing. It's just a really big problem. So if we wait for the cavalry to come, it's just not going to get fixed. So I went to some of my really, really successful friends who have a tremendous amount of money and maybe less time, and I just said, guys, I've got an idea. Let's basically take donations and tax exempt debt. Let's create a 501c3. Let's go buy these properties and let's rent them for no profit to working middle class families. And let's let this thing just take all its excess cash flow and just build a growing, huge portfolio of great new housing for the working middle class. It's kind of patterned on what's happened in Vienna, Austria, where about half of the population of Vienna across all wage groups lives in what they call profit restricted housing, which the closest analogy in the US would be nonprofit housing. But we really just don't have nonprofit housing here because there are some very, very restrictive regulations at the federal and state level that make it very difficult. So we've been able to navigate through those and create a new model for how to do that. And our first pilot's been great. And now we're raising money to scale the thing. So really looking forward to it.
That's awesome. And you're looking for the first two folks, families, or whoever to move into
We
those
are
first couple of properties,
right now we're talking to families that want to move in and trying to find the right families that are going to be not only residents, but they will forever be spokespeople for Fulcrum. So that's where we are right now. So if you know some folks in the South Denver area that that are looking for some great housing, send them to fulcrumcommunities.org. And if you want to support it, you can also support it through there or just ping me directly.
Scott, what a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for all of your insight and wisdom and perspectives, examples. A really rich time together. Thank you for joining the Digital Analyst.
John, it is always a delight to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining the Digital Analyst podcast today. I'm so glad you came. Come back in a couple of weeks. We'll have another version, another episode of the Digital Analyst. In the meantime, if you liked what you heard today, definitely look down below and like and subscribe to the InsightJam.com YouTube channel. Thousands, hundreds of thousands now of subscribers, tons of great content there. Go check it out. You'll find a lot more beyond AI and agentic AI. If you want to connect with me, best place is LinkedIn. Connect with me on LinkedIn or check out ferraroconsulting.com. And for Scott, you got to go to LinkedIn to connect, but please do go take a look at Fulcrum Communities. It's a great and much needed nonprofit and philanthropic opportunity. See you again in a couple of weeks.